Let your body settle now. Feel the weight of it, the pleasant heaviness that comes when you stop fighting gravity and simply allow the surface beneath you to hold you completely. You do not need to do anything with this breath. Let it arrive on its own, slow and quiet, like a tide that has been doing this long before you are here to notice it. There is a place that does not appear on any map you have ever held. It sits beyond the reach of radar and satellite, past the coordinates where ocean charts grow vague, and cartographers once wrote, with quiet honesty, that they did not know what lay beyond this line. The ancient Greeks called such places the edge of the world, not with contempt, but with a kind of reverence. What lies beyond the known, they understood, belongs to the gods. Themyscira is that place. It has been called Paradise Island, and the name is not a boast, but a description of something literal. The air there is different. You would know it the moment you arrived, a quality of light that does not burn, that softens everything it touches, that makes the shadows fall gently rather than sharply. The stone of its cliffs is the colour of warm honey at golden hour. The trees grow old without dying. The water in its harbours is so still on certain mornings that you cannot tell where the sea ends and the sky begins. Breathe in with me for a moment, hold it gently, let it go. The island did not always exist in this form. It was made, shaped by the will of the gods in an age so distant that the word ancient fails to contain it. The Olympians are not subtle architects. When Artemis willed a forest, it was not a scattering of saplings. It was ancient oaks already enormous, their roots already deep, their canopies already home to birds who had been singing the same songs for centuries. When Aphrodite willed flowers for the island's slopes, they bloomed in colours that have no name in any human language. When Athena looked upon the island and judged it worthy of habitation, she did not choose just anyone to fill it. She chose women who had suffered, women who had been taken, broken, and discarded by a world that treated them as objects rather than people. The first Amazons were not born on Themyscira. They were gathered from the dead, or those who might as well have been, pulled from the margins of a world that had found no use for them. Souls with nowhere else to go, given somewhere that was entirely theirs. This is important to sit with. The paradise did not precede the people. The paradise was the answer to what those people had been through. It was not a reward for goodness, it was a restoration, a correction. The gods, for once in their long and complicated history, looked at what humanity had done to a portion of itself, and made something whole out of the wreckage. Sit with that for a moment. Let the thought arrive slowly, the way the tide arrives, not rushing, not demanding your attention, simply present when you notice it. The Amazons were not created from nothing. They were remade from something broken. That distinction matters more than it first appears. The island they inhabit is not merely beautiful, it is alive in a way that the world beyond its shores is not. The olive groves bear fruit in every season without prompting. The horses that roam its meadows have a quality of intelligence in their eyes that makes you feel, when they look at you, that they are deciding something about you rather than the other way around. The ruins scattered across its higher slopes are older than the Amazons themselves, remnants of something that stood here before even the gods chose this place, a reminder that the world is always older than we imagine. The Amazons themselves are formidable in a way that takes time to understand. You might look at one and think, warrior, and you would not be wrong. They train every day, not from fear, but from a philosophy that the body kept strong is the body kept free. They have learned, across many centuries, that the only lasting safety is the safety you're capable of defending. But if you looked more closely, you would see that the training is only one layer of what they are. They are also scholars. Their libraries contain texts that were burned in Alexandria, tablets that crumble to dust in the libraries of Babylon, scrolls that the world beyond Themyscira believes were never written. They have had a very long time to accumulate knowledge, and they have done so without the distractions that cause knowledge to be lost in the outside world. No empire rose to burn their archives, no purge demanded that certain truths be buried. The history of the world in its fuller and more honest form lives on Themyscira. They are artists, they are healers, they are architects who look at stone and see not what is there but what it would prefer to become. They are, in every sense of the word, a civilization, one that has simply chosen not to be visible to the civilization that surrounds it. And into this place, this island of remade women, of divine architecture, of light that falls gently and trees that grow old without dying. A child was born, or made, or willed into being. The question of exactly how Diana came to be is one that the story would take years to answer fully, and even then the answer it gave was less a fact than a layering of truths. What is certain is this: she arrived. She was small, and then she was not. She learned to walk on the same stone that Amazons had trained on for 1,000 years before her, and when she fell, the island caught her with a softness that it did not offer to everyone. She grew up in a paradise, yes, but she grew up knowing that paradise was chosen, that it was a decision the gods had made and that her people had earned through suffering. Let your breathing slow now. There is no hurry here. The island has been in place long enough that it is not concerned with your pace. It will still be there when you're ready to look more closely. The warmth of its stone, the silence of its mornings, the sound of the sea arriving against its cliffs without impatience, all of it waits. Diana would grow up understanding something that most people spend their lives avoiding, that the world is very old, that the gods are real and complicated, and that being loved by a place is not the same thing as being protected from everything. Themyscira gave her everything it could. What it could not give her was a reason to stay when the world beyond its shores needed something only she could offer. But that comes later. For now, settle into the image of the island itself, the honey-coloured stone, the tireless olive trees, the horses with their considering eyes, the sea that has no hurry, the light that falls gently on everything it touches. You are at the beginning of something very long and very beautiful. There is no reason to rush toward the end of it. Let the island be itself for a while. Let it breathe around you. Let the sound of it, the wind through ancient canopies, the distant rhythm of training blades, the laughter of women who have been together long enough to find each other genuinely funny, let all of it arrive without demanding anything from you. The training grounds of Themyscira deserve more than a passing mention, because they are unlike anything that has ever existed in the world beyond the island's borders. They are not arenas built for spectacle. They are not stadiums designed to produce winners and vanquish losers. They are practice spaces built with the patient understanding that skill is not a destination but a direction, that the best a warrior can be is always a little further ahead than where they currently stand, and that the work is never finished, only continued. The stone of the training ground is worn smooth in the places where feet have pivoted and planted across many centuries. The equipment, the blades, the shields, the targets, shows the marks of serious use without showing the marks of neglect. Things that matter are maintained. The library that sits at the island's eastern rise is perhaps the most significant building on Themyscira, though it does not announce itself as such. It is not the largest structure on the island. It is not the most architecturally imposing. But it contains, in its long, cool rooms that smell of old parchment, and the particular dust of things that have been very still for a very long time, a record of the world that no institution outside the island possesses in its completeness. The Amazons have been collecting knowledge since before the Library of Alexandria was built, and when that library burned, several of its most important texts had already been copied and transported to Themyscira by methods that the historical record does not discuss. They knew, the way organizations that have lived through many disasters know, that fire comes eventually. They prepared accordingly. The architecture of the island itself, the way buildings sit in relation to each other, the way roads curve rather than proceeding in straight lines, the way market spaces open unexpectedly from what seemed like narrow passages, reflects a philosophy that took centuries to develop. It is the architecture of a civilization that does not value efficiency above all other things. The buildings are not clustered for convenience. They are positioned for beauty, for the way the morning light hits them at particular angles, for the relationship between a colonnade and the olive tree that has grown into conversation with it over 400 years. Themyscira was designed by people who had all the time in the world and who chose to spend that time making the place where they lived genuinely worth inhabiting. Diana grew up inside all of this and absorbed it in the way that children absorb the world in which they are raised, not through deliberate study but through exposure, through the accumulation of 10,000 small impressions that eventually cohere into something that feels, to the person who carries it, simply like the way things are. She didn't know as a child that her ability to notice the emotional register of a room before noticing its physical features was something she had learned. She did not know that her instinct to ask why before accepting how was a quality cultivated in her by the women around her. These things felt simply like herself. The island had done its work so thoroughly that its work was invisible. The sea around Themyscira is not a barrier in the way that ordinary geography produces barriers. It is a condition, an ongoing, sustained act of divine will that keeps the island present in reality while keeping it absent from the maps that the world outside draws of itself. Sailors have passed through the waters that surround it without ever registering the island, not because they looked and did not see, but because the island arranged itself for the duration of their passage in such a way that there was nothing to look at. The space where Themyscira sits simply presented itself as more water, more horizon, more of the unvarying expanse that deep ocean always is. The island chose, and continues to choose, when to be visible. This quality of chosen invisibility is one of the most interesting things about Themyscira as a concept, and it is something that Diana carried with her when she left, not as a power she could deploy, but as an understanding of what it means to exist without needing to announce yourself. The Amazons had learned, across centuries, that the most durable things are often the least visible. The roots of an old tree are not visible. The depth of a person's commitment is not visible. The long work of building a civilization that can sustain itself across 1,000 years does not produce spectacle. It produces, slowly and without drama, something that holds. The nights on Themyscira have a particular quality that visitors to the island, the very few across history who have been permitted to see it, have consistently struggled to describe afterward. The darkness is complete in a way that urban darkness never is. There is no ambient light from somewhere else bleeding into the sky. The stars, as a result, are not the pale suggestion of stars that people in the modern world have mostly learned to accept as what stars look like. They are the full version, layered and various, the closer ones steady, and the further ones flickering with a rhythm that suggests, without insisting upon, something like breathing. Diana grew up under those stars. She knew them by name, in several languages, and by the stories attached to each of them, the mythologies that the Amazons had collected from every culture that had looked up at the same sky and needed to make sense of it. You are here. The island is here. That is enough for now. Feel the surface beneath you again, the weight of your limbs, the quiet architecture of your own body at rest. Breathing happens without your instruction. The chest rises. The chest falls. The world continues its business, and for a little while, you're not required to participate in any of it. To understand what Diana was made to be, you must first understand what she was made to oppose, and that means understanding Ares, not as a metaphor, not as a symbol of the abstract violence that lives in the human heart, but as a god who stood on battlefields and breathed them in like perfume. In the DC universe, Ares is very old, older than Rome, older than Greece, older even than the names that those civilizations gave to the things they feared most. He is the Olympian god of war, the son of Zeus and Hera, and he is not simply powerful, he is nourished by conflict. When armies clash, when cities burn, when the machinery of human destruction grinds forward, Ares grows stronger. He is, in the most literal sense possible, fed by the worst of what humanity does to itself. This is the detail that makes him genuinely frightening in a way that most villains are not. He does not need to scheme or to plan. He does not need to build weapons or recruit soldiers. All he needs to do is exist, and whisper, and wait. Human beings have enough of what he requires already inside them. He simply provides the conditions in which that interior thing is permitted to bloom. The Amazons were, from the very beginning, his opposite number. Ares had grown powerful on the suffering of women who had been destroyed by war, taken as spoils, displaced by conquest, erased by the kind of history that only ever recorded the names of men who wielded weapons. The gods who created Themyscira understood this. The Amazons were not simply a refuge, they were a counterweight. Every day they lived in peace and wisdom, and self-determined strength was a small diminishment of what Ares fed on. They were proof of concept, evidence that the human capacity for destruction was not the whole of the story. Breathe in slowly, let the breath arrive without effort, let it go without grief. Ares did not take kindly to this arrangement. He never has in any telling of the story. There is something about a civilization that refuses to participate in war that he finds personally offensive, and in a very real sense it is personal. The Amazons are not merely an affront to his philosophy, they are a drain on his power. Every generation that grows up in peace on Themyscira is a generation that does not feed him. In the mythology that DC has built around Wonder Woman, particularly in its modern iterations, the ones that gave Diana a story worthy of the character, Ares pursued the Amazons across centuries. He whispered in the ears of generals who marched against peaceful peoples. He nudged the conditions of the world toward chaos when peace threatened to take hold. He is patient in the way that only beings who cannot die are patient. He can afford to wait. He has waited before. What he did not anticipate in the story that DC's most careful writers have constructed was Diana. Not because she surprised him with strength. Ares has faced strong opponents before. He did not anticipate her because she represented something he had genuinely never encountered. A child born of both worlds, divine and human, ancient and immediate. A being who could look at war without flinching, understand its logic, feel its terrible pull, and still choose to stand against it. The other Amazons were forged in opposition to what they had endured. Diana was something different. She was forged in the understanding of it. She was raised on Themyscira, surrounded by women who carried the memory of what the world outside had done to them, and she absorbed that knowledge without being defined by it. She learned to fight because she was taught that strength without purpose is only noise. She learned philosophy and history and the names of things in languages that no one outside the island had spoken in 3,000 years. She learned to love, deeply and without reservation, the women who were her family. And she learned about Ares, not as an abstract enemy, as a force with a logic, a being with a comprehensible motivation, a god whose nature she would need to understand before she could ever hope to act against it. Hippolyta, her mother, the queen of the Amazon, did not shelter Diana from this knowledge. She gave it to her carefully, the way you give someone a weapon, making certain they understand what it can do before they hold it. There is something in this that connects to the Diana that audiences know from her appearances in the modern DC films and comics. The woman who walks onto a battlefield in the First World War. The woman who looks at a world in which humans are destroying each other on an industrial scale and does not look away, does not calculate the cost of involvement, simply moves toward the harm because she is the person standing there who can do something about it. That response did not emerge from nowhere. It was cultivated on Themyscira by women who had decided collectively that suffering witnessed is suffering shared, and that shared suffering demands a response. Ares shaped the Amazons by being their opposite. He gave them, without intending to, a purpose. Every war he encouraged was another argument for their existence. Every civilization he nudged towards self-destruction was another demonstration of why Themyscira's experiment in sustained peace had value. He was, in the most ironic possible sense, their greatest justification. Let the thought settle without grasping at it. The way a stone settles to the bottom of clear water, slowly, without force. Diana grew up in the shadow of this ancient opposition without being consumed by it. She learned to carry the awareness of Ares the way her people carried the memory of their own suffering. Present, acknowledged, not denied, but not permitted to become the whole of what she was. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about her formation. She was raised to be a weapon against the god of war, and she emerged from that upbringing as something very difficult to weaponize. Her strength is real. The stories never pretend otherwise. She was trained by the greatest warriors in human history, by women who had centuries to refine what fighting could be when it was approached as a discipline rather than a reflex. She learned from Antiope, her aunt in many versions of the story, a warrior of legendary focus, who understood that the difference between skill and power is the difference between choice and compulsion. But the strength was always in service of something. Not the island's survival. Themyscira was well capable of defending itself. The strength was in service of an idea that the island embodied, and that Diana would eventually carry out into the world. That the capacity for violence and the choice not to use it are not the same thing as weakness. That a person who can destroy and chooses to build is not a person who has suppressed something. They are a person who has understood something. Ares never learned this. In every iteration of the story, this is his fundamental limitation. He is powerful beyond almost anything else in the DC cosmos. He is ancient and patient and genuinely frightening in the scale of what he can bring about. And he has never, in any version of himself across any telling of this mythology, understood why strength and gentleness are not mutually exclusive. Diana was being raised, without quite knowing it yet, to show him. The history of Ares in the DC mythology is not a simple history of evil. This is the nuance that distinguishes the better versions of his story from the lesser ones, and it is worth attending to carefully. He is not evil in the sense of being chaotic or sadistic or driven by a desire to cause suffering for its own sake. He is, in the deepest sense, a being of purpose, and his purpose is war. He believes in war the way an evangelist believes in their faith, with total conviction, with genuine passion, with the certainty that comes from having watched his belief confirmed by events so many times that doubt has become functionally impossible. He has seen, across his very long existence, what conflict does that peace cannot. He has seen the technologies that war accelerates, the metallurgy, the engineering, the medicine that develops when broken bodies are common enough that healing them becomes a priority. He has seen the political structures that shake loose under military pressure, the old injustices that become visible when war strips away the comfortable social arrangements that kept them hidden. He is not wrong that war has sometimes produced change that peace was not producing. He is catastrophically wrong about the conclusion he draws from this, that war is therefore good, or necessary, or the truest expression of what human beings are. But his argument is not groundless, and Diana has always understood that. The Amazons from the very beginning were not simply defined by what Ares had done to the women who became them, they were defined by their response to it. The response was not revenge. Hippolyta had understood early in the island's life that a civilization built around revenge was a civilization that had simply outsourced its destruction schedule to the past. The response was, instead, the patient construction of an alternative. If the world outside produced war, Themyscira would produce its absence. If the world outside erased women from its record, Themyscira would be a place where the record was complete. If the world outside treated strength as a license for exploitation, Themyscira would demonstrate across the longest possible time frame that strength and restraint were not opposites but companions. This project, the project of being a counter-argument to everything that Ares represented, required a kind of sustained collective will that most civilizations cannot maintain. The usual pattern is that the urgency of a founding vision fades as the conditions that made it urgent fade from living memory. The people who founded something because they had experienced its necessity are replaced by people who inherited its benefits without its costs, and the commitment loosens. Themyscira had not followed this pattern. The Amazons had found ways to keep the founding vision alive, through ritual, through education, through the maintenance of what they called the living history, in which the stories of what had made the island necessary were told not as ancient events but as present realities. The past on Themyscira was not behind them, it was part of the air. The philosophical tradition that the Amazons built on Themyscira had, at its centre, a question that most philosophical traditions consider secondary to questions of knowledge or ethics. The question of what strength is for, not what strength is. They understood that clearly enough in both physical and moral terms. But what its purpose was, what obligation, if any, came with the capacity to do things that other beings could not do. The answer they arrived at, across many generations of debate and practice and lived experience, was not simple. Strength, they concluded, is not a license. It is a responsibility that arrives without being requested, and does not diminish when it becomes inconvenient. A strong being who looks away from what its strength could address has made a choice. Not a neutral choice, but an active one, with consequences as real as the consequences of any action. The Amazon's ethic of strength was, therefore, an ethic of engagement. You do not get to be strong and also innocent of what your strength leaves unaddressed. Diana absorbed this ethic so thoroughly that she could not have articulated it as a principle separate from herself. It was simply how she thought about existence. The gap between capacity and action was, for her, always a moral question rather than a practical one. Not can I help, but what happens if I do not? What? Let your body grow a little heavier now, the way it does when the thinking slows and the rest begins to have its way with you. The story continues. There is no hurry to follow it. It will still be here when you return. Rest here for a moment. Nothing is required of you. The breath comes. The breath goes. The room around you is quiet, and even if it is not, the sounds of it are far enough away that they are texture rather than intrusion. You're safe here. You're allowed to sink a little deeper. There is a question at the heart of Diana's story that took decades of comics history to answer fully, and the answer, when it finally arrived in the modern era, changed the nature of everything that had come before. The question is simple. Who is she, really? The answer is considerably more complicated. For many years, the official story was this. Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons, longed for a child. The island had given the Amazons almost everything: immortality, peace, purpose, knowledge. But children, the particular and irreplaceable experience of watching something you love grow from a small and helpless thing into a person, this Themyscira could not provide on its own. The Amazons did not age, they did not die, and they did not, in the ordinary way of things, give birth. So Hippolyta did what people have always done when ordinary means fail them. She prayed. She shaped clay from the shore of Themyscira, from the beach where the island met the sea, where two worlds touched, and she built with her own hands the form of a daughter. She poured into it everything she hoped for, every quality she wanted this child to carry, every dream she had about who this person might become, and the gods, moved by the depth of what she felt, breathed life into what she had made. This is a genuinely beautiful creation story. It connects Diana to the oldest human traditions of imagining how life begins, to Prometheus shaping humanity from clay, to Pygmalion loving the thing he made into being, to every parent who has held a wish for a child before the child existed. And for a long time, it was enough. Breathe in, hold it just for a heartbeat, let it go. But the Rebirth era of DC Comics, particularly the work of Greg Rucka, who returned to Wonder Woman in 2016 with the explicit intention of restoring coherence to a story that had grown complicated across decades, told a different truth, or rather, it told the layer of truth that had been present all along, buried beneath the one the story was permitted to tell. Sit with this, let it arrive slowly. Diana is the daughter of Zeus, not metaphorically, not through divine blessing, but directly. The blood child of the king of the Olympian gods and Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. The clay story, the beautiful, poetic story about a mother's love and divine breath, was a fiction. Not a lie told with cruelty, but a secret kept with love. Hippolyta knew what it would mean for Diana's life if it became known whose daughter she was. She knew what gods do to each other's children when those children become inconvenient. She knew what Hera, Zeus's wife, had done to the offspring of her husband's other liaisons. So she gave her daughter a story that was still true in the ways that mattered. Diana was made from love. She was shaped by intention. She was breathed into being by divine will. All of this remained accurate. The specific mechanism, the specific god who had participated in her creation, was the part that stayed hidden. This revelation does something important to the nature of Diana's power, and it is worth pausing here to let it register. When she lifted a tank or flew above a battlefield, or withstood a blow that would have reduced stone to powder, those abilities were not simply gifts from gods who approved of her mission. They were inheritance. She was not a human woman made divine by blessing. She was divine from the beginning, carrying in her very cells the architecture of godhood. But she did not know this. She grew up on Themyscira believing herself to be what her mother told her she was, a child of clay and love and prayer, something unique in the history of the island, born of longing rather than the ordinary procedures of the world. She trained alongside Amazons who had lived for centuries and was extraordinary among them, excelling in ways that her teachers noted, but did not always fully explain. There is something in this that connects to the experience of growing up without knowing the full story of who you are, the sense that your capacities exceed what you have been told about yourself, the feeling that certain things come to you with an ease that should require more effort, and that you do not entirely understand why. Diana lived inside this uncertainty for a very long time before the truth became available to her. Zeus himself is a complicated figure in this story. He is not, in the DC mythology, a benevolent patriarch presiding over creation with a steady hand. He is powerful and he is ancient and he is, by almost any moral standard, deeply flawed. He loves in the way that very powerful people sometimes love, intensely, possessively, without always considering what that love costs the person it lands on. His choice to take part in Diana's creation was not straightforwardly noble. His reasons were his own, and they were not entirely selfless. And yet, the thing that was made from that encounter, whatever its complications and its costs, is Diana, who is genuine, who is good in a way that her parentage does not fully explain and cannot entirely account for. She is not good because Zeus is good. She is not good because Hippolyta is good. She is good because she has chosen, across a very long life of encountering both the beauty and the horror that the world contains, to be the thing that stands between the horror and the people it threatens. Godhood in this story is not simply a matter of who your parents are. This is what the revelation of her divine parentage ultimately demonstrates. Diana did not become significant because she turned out to be Zeus's daughter. The revelation of her parentage simply explained what the story had already shown, that she was capable of things that ordinary human strength cannot account for, and that those capabilities had always been in her, waiting to be understood. The clay story and the divine parentage story are not, in the end, in conflict with each other. A child shaped by love and a child born of gods are not mutually exclusive descriptions of the same person. What Hippolyta built with her hands and what Zeus contributed to her making are both true, and neither of them is the whole of who Diana is. She is the synthesis of those things, and she is also the choices she has made with what she was given. Let that thought drift now. Let it go the way a leaf goes when you set it on moving water, present for a moment, and then carried gently out of sight. The body is heavier than it was. The breathing is slower. There's no need to hold on to any specific image. The story will still be there. It has been there for a very long time. The weight of what Hippolyta chose to conceal from her daughter is worth sitting with. She was not a person given to deception. The Queen of the Amazons, in every version of the story that treats her seriously, is a figure of immense dignity and a commitment to honesty that her whole civilization embodies. To choose to conceal Diana's parentage required her to hold, for decades, a secret that was in fundamental tension with everything she believed and everything she had built. She did it because she calculated, correctly by most readings of the story, that the alternative was worse. Zeus had other children in the DC mythology, demigods scattered across history, beings of significant power who had been born into a world that did not have a category for them and who had, in most cases, not fared well as a result. Hera's attention to these offspring was not kindly. The divine order of Olympus was not a system designed to nurture the unexpected. It was a system designed to maintain itself. An unexpected, powerful offspring of the king of the gods were a form of instability that the system's self-preservation mechanisms tended to address in ways that were not gentle. Hippolyta's calculation was therefore not a betrayal of Diana, but a protection of her, and not only in the narrow sense of protecting her from Hera's potential hostility. She was also protecting Diana from the particular kind of identity crisis that comes from discovering in adulthood that the story of who you are is fundamentally different from the story you were raised inside. She wanted Diana to become herself first, to develop, on her own terms and through her own experience, a sense of who she was that was solid enough to absorb the revelation of her parentage when it finally came, without that revelation becoming the organizing principle of her identity. In this, Hippolyta succeeded. When the truth of Diana's parentage emerged, in whatever version of the story one is following, Diana received it not as the discovery of her real self, but as additional information about a self she already knew. She did not become Zeus's daughter at the moment of revelation. She learned that she had always been Zeus's daughter. The difference between those two things is the difference between an identity being given to you and an identity being confirmed. One relocates the self, the other simply adds context to it. Zeus himself in the DC mythology is largely absent from Diana's upbringing in a physical sense. He does not appear on Themyscira. He does not make himself known to her as a child. Whether this is kindness, a deliberate choice to allow her to develop without the complications that his presence would introduce, or negligence, or something more complicated than either of those categories can contain, the story has handled differently in different eras. What is consistent is that his absence is not experienced by Diana as a wound. She was raised in a community of women who were each other's family in the fullest sense, and the concept of a missing father does not map neatly onto an upbringing in which fatherhood was never part of the social architecture. The mythological tradition of the divine child who must be hidden from the wrath of a jealous god is as old as storytelling itself. Perseus was hidden, Heracles was concealed, imperfectly, and suffered for the imperfect concealment. The child of divine parentage who survives to fulfill a destiny does so almost always because someone early in their life made a difficult choice to protect them by obscuring the truth of what they were. Hippolyta understood herself to be operating within a tradition, even as she was also operating outside it. The Amazons' history included the stories of these hidden children. They had collected the accounts, preserved them in the library, and discussed them with the particular analytical rigour that characterised their scholarship. They understood what the pattern was and why it repeated. They understood also that the outcomes of the concealment varied, that hiding a child from divine wrath was not a guarantee of safety but a wager, and that the odds of the wager were affected by how completely the concealment was maintained and for how long. Her decision to give Diana the clay and breath story rather than the story of her actual parentage was not, therefore, made in ignorance. It was made with full knowledge of the tradition she was working within, with full understanding of the risks of the choice and the risks of the alternative, and with the particular kind of courage that is required to make a decision whose consequences will unfold over decades rather than days. She would not know, for a very long time, whether she had chosen correctly. She accepted this. The not knowing was the price of the protection. The Rebirth era's handling of Diana's parentage is significant not only for what it reveals, but for how it chooses to reveal it. The revelation does not come as a dramatic disclosure from a single authoritative source. It arrives, instead, through the accumulated pressure of contradictions, moments in which the story Diana has been living does not entirely cohere with the story she's been told about herself, in which her capabilities exceed what her origin story should be able to account for, in which the gods who know the truth behave toward her in ways that carry the weight of knowledge she does not yet possess. The truth, in other words, was always present. The process of coming to know it was the process of learning to read the signs that had been there all along. You are the daughter of everything that made you, and so, it turns out, is she. Let your eyes stay closed. The breath is slow now, unhurried. Your body knows how to do this without instruction, how to let go in increments, how to become a little less urgent with each passing minute. That is the direction we're moving in, gently, without force. Before Diana ever set foot in the world beyond Themyscira, before she lifted a single sword or crossed a single ocean, she was a child who grew up asking questions that her mother could not always answer. This is not a minor detail. It is, in fact, the quality that separates her from nearly every other figure in the DC pantheon. She wanted to understand things, not simply to know them. Knowledge, on an island full of scholars and libraries and women who had lived through the full span of recorded history, was not particularly difficult to acquire. She wanted to understand the reasons behind the facts. Why did war exist when peace was preferable? Why did the gods behave as they did when they were clearly capable of more? Why was the world outside Themyscira's shores so much more chaotic than the world within them, given that the people outside had access to the same capacity for reason and compassion that the Amazons possessed? Hippolyta answered what she could. The other Amazons, Antiope in particular, with her warrior's precision and her blunt honesty, answered in their own ways. But Diana's questions had a quality to them that eventually outpaced the island's ability to satisfy her. She was not asking because she was dissatisfied with Themyscira. She was asking because she was already, even as a child, turning towards something beyond it. There is a scene in many versions of her origin, depicted in comics, hinted at in the 2017 film, present in the underlying mythology that all the adaptations draw from, in which Diana discovers, as a young girl, what the world of men actually looks like. The encounter is different in different tellings. Sometimes it's a soldier who crashes from the sky into the waters of Themyscira's harbour. Sometimes it is a vision, a mirror, a scroll that describes the suffering being enacted beyond the island's invisible borders. In every version, her response is the same. She does not ask whether she should go, she asks how soon. Breathe in slowly, the breath is cool, let it settle in the chest and then release it, warm and slow. The contest, the competition held among the Amazons to determine who would be the champion sent out into the world, is another detail that shifts across tellings, but its meaning stays constant. Hippolyta forbade Diana from entering. This is the detail that matters, not the contest itself, not the training, not the armour and weapons that the champion would carry. The fact that a mother who loved her daughter deeply looked at what was being asked and said, "Not her, not this one." Hippolyta knew what she was trying to protect. She knew that Diana, once she entered the world beyond Themyscira, would not return easily. Perhaps would not return at all. She knew the nature of what was out there, had lived through enough of it herself in the life before the island, to understand that the world has a way of consuming the people who try to fix it. Not because it is malicious exactly, but because the need is infinite, and the people willing to meet it are always finite, and the mathematics of that situation are not kind. Diana disobeyed her. She entered the contest disguised, competed on her own merits, and won. When the disguise was removed and the Queen saw who her champion was, the moment was not, in the best tellings, a moment of anger. It was something quieter and more devastating. The recognition that the thing you feared most is also the thing you are most proud of. That the child you shaped has become, through your own teaching, exactly the kind of person who would do precisely this. She let her go. She let her go because she understood that Diana had not defied her out of recklessness or rebellion, but out of the same quality that Hippolyta had spent years cultivating in her. The belief that, if you are capable of helping, and you have the knowledge that help is needed, the question of whether you should act is not really a question at all. The armour she was given is worth a moment's attention. In the modern era of DC storytelling, Diana's armour is not simply protective equipment. It is a statement, a visual argument about what the person wearing it intends. The red and gold, in various iterations, carries the colours of Ares himself. The colour of blood, the colour of fire, recontextualised into something worn by the person standing against what those colours have always represented. It is a deliberate provocation and a deliberate claim. She's not pretending that war doesn't exist. She's walking into its territory and announcing that she does not belong to it. The lasso of truth deserves its own pause here. It was given to her by the gods, forged in different versions from different materials, golden metal, divine fire, the unbreakable thread of honesty that the gods themselves cannot circumvent. It does not compel people to say what the person holding the lasso wants to hear. It compels them to say what is actually true. This is a finer distinction than it first appears. The lasso is not a tool for the winning of arguments. It is a tool for the ending of deception, including self-deception, which is the most persistent and the most damaging kind. She carried these things out of Themyscira and into a world that had no category for her. She was not, by the standards of that world, a goddess. She was not, by the standards of Themyscira, simply a human. She was the thing she had always been, which was both and neither, the daughter of an island civilization and the daughter of the king of the gods, carrying weapons that enforced truth and wearing armour that refused to pretend that violence could be wished away. The world she arrived in was not ready for her. The world is in many ways never ready for her. Each era of DC storytelling deposits Diana into a different version of the world and watches the same thing happen. The world tries to categorize her, and fails, tries to diminish her, and fails, tries to find the edge of what she can endure and discovers that the edge keeps moving. Let your breathing slow a little more. There is no specific image you need to hold. If one arrives, let it. If the mind wanders, that is fine. The wandering is its own form of rest. The story does not need your full attention to continue. It is patient. It has been telling itself for a very long time. Diana left paradise not because paradise was insufficient. She left because she had been raised by a queen who loved her, by an island that formed her, by an education in the full breadth of what the world was capable of. To understand that beauty which coexists quietly with suffering at a safe distance is not the same thing as goodness. Goodness requires proximity. It requires the willingness to be in the same room as the thing that needs to be changed. The contest that would determine which Amazon became the champion sent to the world of men was held in the tradition of Themyscira's ancient practices, a series of trials that tested not simply strength or speed or fighting skill, but the integration of all of these with judgment, with restraint, with the ability to choose, under pressure, the right level of force for the specific situation. The trials were designed by women who had thought very carefully about what it actually meant to be a warrior in service of peace, and they reflected that thinking in their architecture. The worst possible outcome, the one the trials were specifically designed to avoid producing, was a champion who was powerful but not wise, who could win but not know when not to. Antiope, who trained many of the contenders over the years, had her own view of what the trials were for. She believed, and had argued this point with Hippolyta on more than one occasion, in the way that sisters argue about things that matter, that the trials were not so much a selection process as a revelation process. They did not create the champion, they revealed who the champion already was, by placing the contenders in conditions in which their truest qualities could not remain hidden. A person who was fundamentally reckless would be revealed as such, regardless of how thoroughly they had trained to suppress that recklessness. A person who was fundamentally compassionate would be revealed as such, even in the heat of competition, even when compassion was not the strategically optimal response. The armour that the champion received, that Diana received, in the specific story being told here, was crafted by Hephaestus in most versions, or by the Amazon's own master smiths in others. In either case, it was not simply equipment. It was a statement about what the wearer was undertaking and who the wearer was understood to be. The craftsmanship was meticulous in the way that things are crafted when the people making them genuinely believe in the purpose of what they are making. Every join in the metal was exact. Every surface was finished to the degree that the light moved across it smoothly, without catching on roughness. It was armour made by people who wanted the person inside it to live, and who had put that wanting into the work. The shield deserves specific attention. A sword is a weapon of offence, a tool for ending something. A shield is a weapon of another kind, a statement that the thing behind it has value worth protecting, and that the person holding it has accepted the responsibility of that protection. Wonder Woman's shield, in the most thoughtful tellings of her story, is not a secondary consideration after the sword or the lasso. It is, in some ways, the most Diana object she carries, the one that most completely expresses her philosophy. She will stand between harm and the thing harm is moving toward. She will put herself in the path, not because she is invincible, but because she has decided that is where she's supposed to be. The morning Diana left Themyscira, in whatever version of the story one is following, the morning is always there, and it always has a specific quality, was one that the island seemed to feel. This is not mysticism. Themyscira, as a place sustained by divine will and inhabiting a relationship with the women who lived on it, that ordinary geography does not develop with its inhabitants, registered significant departures in ways that were not dramatic but were not nothing. The light that morning was unchanged. The sea was unchanged. The olive trees gave no sign, but there was, among the women who gathered to see the champion off, a quality of attention that was different from ordinary attention, more concentrated, more careful, the way people look at things they understand they may not see again in the same form. Hippolyta's farewell to Diana has been depicted differently in different versions of the story, and each version reveals something about the particular era's understanding of what the relationship between them means. In some versions it is formal. The Queen of the Amazons sends off the champion of the Amazons, and the personal is subordinated to the ceremonial. In other versions it is almost unbearably intimate. Two people who are each other's most important person in the world doing the thing that love sometimes requires, which is letting go. The version that feels most true, not to any specific text, but to the underlying reality that all the texts are trying to capture, is somewhere between these. A queen who is also a mother who has trained her child for exactly this moment, and who finds, at the moment of its arrival, that the training has not made it easier to feel. The champion who is also her daughter, already turned toward the horizon, already living in the place she is going to rather than the place she is leaving, doing this not because she loves Themyscira less, but because she loves it enough to carry its best qualities out into the world where they are needed. She understood this completely, and she went. Let your body soften now. The muscles of the shoulders, the jaw, the hands, they do not need to be held in readiness for anything. There is nothing here that requires your readiness. Let the weight of the limbs become pleasant rather than heavy, the way the body feels after a long walk when you have finally sat down and the ache has turned to warmth. When Diana arrived in the world of men, she arrived as an ambassador. This is the title the Amazons gave to the champion they sent out. Not warrior, not soldier, not weapon. Ambassador. The word matters because it carries within it an assumption about the purpose of the mission. An ambassador does not conquer. An ambassador does not impose. An ambassador enters a foreign world and attempts to build a bridge between what that world is and what it could become. The world she arrived in most tellings of her origin, was a world at war. The First World War in the film, various conflicts in the comics. The specific conflict is less important than what it demonstrated. That human beings had found ways to destroy each other on a scale that even the Amazon's long knowledge of history had not fully prepared Diana to witness. She walked onto the battlefield and she did not hesitate. This is the image that has come to define her in the cultural imagination, stepping out of a trench, crossing no man's land, shields raised against fire that simply did not stop her. The soldiers around her, who had been crouching in the mud for weeks, watched a woman in armour walk calmly through what they had been told was impassable. The image resonates because it is not just physical. It is the embodiment of a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with not being afraid. It is the courage of choosing to move toward the thing rather than away from it. She was not naive. This is essential to understanding her, and it is something that lazy storytelling often gets wrong. Diana does not walk into harm because she does not understand what harm is. She has been educated on Themyscira by women who carry the memory of what harm did to them. She has read the history of every war humanity has waged. She knows in precise and detailed terms what a battlefield does to the people on it. She goes anyway. She goes because knowledge of what harm is and willingness to stand between harm and the people it threatens are not in tension with each other. They are the same impulse. The knowing and the going are a single motion. Breathe in slowly. Let the exhale be long and unguarded. Let the thoughts drift wherever they want to go. Sit with this for a moment. The world was showing her, in these early encounters, something that could have broken a different person. It was showing her the distance between what the world was and what her upbringing had promised it could be. Themyscira was the proof of concept, the demonstration that human-adjacent beings could build something genuinely peaceful, genuinely wise, genuinely beautiful. The world outside was the evidence against that concept. Everywhere she looked, she saw the same capacity for destruction that Ares had always fed on, operating without him, sustained by forces far more mundane and therefore far more difficult to address than a single god's malevolent influence. The lesson this could have delivered, the lesson that cynicism would have taken from it, is that Themyscira was an exception, a beautiful accident sustained by divine intervention that had no relevance to the way the real world worked. Many people, encountering the same evidence, have arrived at this conclusion and found it privately comforting in the way that surrendering to a difficult truth can be comforting. Diana did not arrive there. She looked at the same evidence and drew a different conclusion, that if the world was not yet what it could be, that was not an argument for abandoning the effort. It was an argument for continuing it. The gap between what is and what is possible is not a reason to stop, it is the definition of the work. In her early years in the world of men, she built relationships that deepened this understanding. The people she moved alongside, soldiers, diplomats, ordinary civilians caught in circumstances they had not chosen, were not, she discovered, the simple victims that a certain kind of heroism might have wanted them to be. They were complicated. They were capable of great courage and significant cruelty, sometimes in the same afternoon. They loved each other in ways that were tender and permanent, and they hurt each other in ways that were casual and devastating. She loved them anyway, not despite their complications, but through them, understanding that the complications were not a flaw in the design but the design itself. A being that cannot choose to be cruel cannot choose to be kind. The capacity for one is the same capacity as the other, directed differently. The Amazons understood this theoretically. Diana was coming to understand it practically, in the field, through the specific and irreplaceable process of knowing individual people well enough to see all of what they were. Steve Trevor, in most versions of the story, is the first of these relationships. He's not saved by her in a simple sense. He is, in the more careful tellings, someone who shows her something. The way that a particular kind of human courage, the courage of a person who knows they are not extraordinary but acts anyway, has a quality of its own that divine strength does not automatically confer. She learns from him not because he is greater than her in any measurable way, but because what he is different from what she is. and difference, honestly engaged with, teaches things that similarity cannot. The mantle of champion, she was discovering, was not a thing you wore. It was a practice. You did not put it on once and then carry it without effort. You renewed it, continually, through the choices you made in specific situations with specific people in the specific light of the specific moment you were actually in. Heroism, she was learning, is not a state of being. It is a verb. Let the images soften now. The battlefield, the trench, the figure moving forward through fire that cannot stop her. Let those images become less sharp, more like impressions, the way dreams soften as the morning comes. You're moving towards sleep, and the story moves with you at whatever pace you choose. The champion's mantle was heavy. She would carry it for a very long time, across many versions of the story, through losses that accumulated in ways she had not been prepared for. People she loved aged and died in the way that human beings age and die. Fully, finally, without the option of continuing. She kept going. Not because she could not feel the weight of those losses, but because she had decided somewhere in the early years of her time in the world that grief and purpose are not opposites, that you can carry both, that you must. The world Diana arrived in had been shaped by forces she could identify by name. She had studied them. She had read the histories, the ones kept in Themyscira's library, the complete versions, the ones that did not soften the difficult parts for the comfort of the people reading them. She knew what colonialism had produced, and what industrialization had produced, and what the specific combination of mechanized warfare and nationalist ideology had produced in the early 20th century. She knew these things the way a doctor knows the names of diseases, precisely without flinching, and with the knowledge that naming them does not by itself address them. What she had not known, because no text could fully prepare her for it, was the texture of living inside those forces, the way that large historical processes, the ones that historians would later describe in terms of movements and eras and turning points, were experienced by the people inside them not as large historical processes but as the specific weather of a specific morning, the mud underfoot, the quality of light through smoke, the sound that a particular kind of fear makes when it has been held inside a human chest for long enough that it has become, for the person carrying it, simply the background noise of existence. She learned this by being present, by moving through those environments without the distance that would have made them manageable. She could have maintained distance. The power available to her allowed it. She could have operated above the battlefield, literally looking down at the pattern of the conflict from a height at which individual suffering becomes statistical. She chose the ground level, every time, not out of martyrdom, not out of a desire to demonstrate that she could endure what ordinary soldiers endured, but because she understood, at a level she could not always articulate, that the work she was there to do required genuine presence. You cannot help what you cannot see. You cannot see what you will not be close enough to perceive. The relationships she built in these years were not uniformly positive or uncomplicated. She was, to many of the people she encountered, inexplicable, a woman of impossible capability arriving from a direction that made no sense, carrying convictions that the world around her had not ratified and would not for a very long time. Some people received her with gratitude. Some received her with suspicion. Some attempted to use her, to align her power with their particular agenda, to recruit her formidable presence in service of goals that were narrower than what she had come to serve. She navigated all of this without becoming either naive about human motivation or cynical about human worth. This navigation, the ongoing practice of remaining genuinely open to people while not being manipulable by them, is itself a kind of power that the story does not always foreground, but that the best versions of Wonder Woman always embody. It requires a very specific kind of discernment, the ability to distinguish between the person someone is presenting and the person they actually are, to hold both the performance and the reality in view simultaneously, and to respond to the latter while not humiliating the former. It is the practical application of the lasso's principle, truth-seeking, in the ongoing daily interactions of a person who is committed to honesty, enacted without a physical object purely through attention and care, and the people Diana encountered in the world of men were, in the aggregate, deeply inconsistent. This is not a criticism. It is simply an accurate description of what human beings are, beings whose behaviour varies significantly, depending on the conditions they are in, the the pressures they are under, the stories they have been told about themselves and about other people, and the specific chemical and experiential circumstances of a given moment. A person who was cruel in one context was sometimes genuinely kind in another. A person who had done terrible things had also, in many cases, done generous ones. The categories that simple stories use, hero, villain, ordinary person, could not contain what Diana was actually observing. She developed, in response to this complexity, a practice of radical specificity. She tried, in every encounter, to respond not to the category a person seemed to belong to, but to the specific reality of the specific person in the specific moment. This sounds simple. It is not. It requires the continuous suspension of the conclusions you have already drawn, the continuous willingness to let new information revise your understanding, the continuous discipline of treating each encounter as itself rather than as an instance of a type. Most beings, human or divine, find this discipline unsustainable beyond short periods. Diana made it her default mode. The cost of this practice was real. Being genuinely present to each person and each situation, without the protective distance of category or generalization, meant being affected by things that a more defended being would not have been affected by. It meant being genuinely moved by what was moving and genuinely troubled by what was troubling, in a way that did not allow for the detachment that would have made the work easier. She was sometimes, by her own account in the stories that show her interior life, exhausted by this. The answer to exhaustion for her was not to reduce the level of engagement, but to find the resources that made it sustainable, the relationships, the practices, the return to Themyscira when it was possible, and to tend those resources with the same care she brought to everything else. The question of what it means to be welcome somewhere, to arrive in a world that was not built with you in mind and to make a place in it anyway, is one that Diana navigated with a combination of grace and deliberateness that the story does not always foreground, but that is always present in the background of her actions. She was not from the world she'd come to serve. She did not share its history in the lived embodied sense. She had read about it, had been educated about it, had been prepared for it as thoroughly as Themyscira could prepare someone for something that Themyscira was specifically designed to be an alternative to. But preparation and belonging are different things, and the difference between them was something she encountered every day in the specific texture of existing in a world that found her extraordinary rather than ordinary. She went on. The world continued its complicated self, and somewhere at the back of the story, patient as only an ancient god can be patient, Ares waited for the moment when all of that would finally be put to its true test. The breath is slower now. The body has been letting go in increments, the way ice lets go of cold when the season changes, gradually without announcement. You may not even have noticed how much heavier your limbs have become, how much quieter the mind. That is exactly how it is supposed to feel. In the years that followed Diana's arrival in the world, she encountered something that Themyscira had prepared her for intellectually but not emotionally, the full reality of the Olympian gods, not as figures in a story told by scholars on the island, not as names attached to prayers that sometimes produced results and sometimes did not, as individuals with personalities and agendas and the specific kind of thoughtlessness that comes from having been all-powerful for so long that the concept of consequence has lost its meaning. The Olympians of DC's mythology are not the serene, distant presences of certain religious traditions. They are loud. They are vain. They are capable of extraordinary warmth and spectacular pettiness in equal measure, sometimes in the same conversation. They have opinions about Diana that range from protective pride to outright hostility, and they are not always consistent about which feeling is dominant on any given day. Hera is the most significant of these complicating forces, Zeus's wife, queen of the gods, a being of immense dignity and equally immense grievance, because Zeus, across his very long divine life, had given her an extraordinary number of grievances to carry. His relationship with Hippolyta, which produced Diana, was one of many. Hera knew about it. Hera knew about all of them. Her response to Diana's existence was, for a long time, a complex oscillation between wanting to destroy the evidence of her husband's infidelity and being grudgingly moved by what that evidence had become. In some of the most interesting iterations of the story, particularly the New 52 and Rebirth eras, Diana and Hera developed something that neither of them expected. A relationship. Not a simple one, not a comfortable one, but genuine in the way that relationships between complicated people who have initially viewed each other with hostility can become genuine when circumstances force them into proximity for long enough. Hera eventually comes to see in Diana something she had not initially been able to perceive through her resentment, a person who embodies the qualities that Olympus was supposed to represent and rarely does: justice, compassion, honesty so complete that it functions as its own kind of power. Diana, for her part, comes to see in Hera something more than the goddess who wanted her dead, a woman who has spent an eternity being betrayed by the person she loved most, and who has, against considerable odds, not allowed that betrayal to become the whole of what she is. Breathe in, slow, let the exhale go without guiding it. Athena's relationship with Diana is different in character. Athena is the goddess of wisdom and warfare. Not war as Ares practices it, not conflict for its own sake, but the strategic application of force in service of a justified end. She is perhaps the Olympian whose nature most closely resembles what Diana aspires to, a being who can understand violence without being consumed by it, who sees the battlefield as a puzzle with ethical dimensions as well as tactical ones. Athena gave Diana wisdom in the way the gods give things, not as a gift that is simply bestowed, but as a capacity that is unlocked through encounter. The wisdom Diana carries is not the passive accumulation of knowledge. It is the ability to take information and translate it into right action, in conditions of uncertainty and urgency. This is a considerably rarer quality than intelligence, and the gods recognized it in her earlier than Diana recognized it in herself. Hermes, in the Rebirth era particularly, becomes something close to an ally, and in some versions Diana's half-brother, another of Zeus's many offspring. He's quick and irreverent where Diana is deliberate and earnest, and the dynamic between them has the quality of a sibling relationship that has not had time to become comfortable, a mutual recognition that is not yet entirely trust. He gives her speed, he carries messages, he is, in the tradition of messenger gods, always slightly ahead of the story and always a little evasive about exactly what he knows. Poseidon is a presence in her story less through direct interaction than through implication. The sea that surrounds Themyscira is his domain, and the island's protection from the outside world is partly his doing. The ocean that separates paradise from everything else is not merely water, it is a boundary maintained by divine will, and that maintenance has always been a gesture toward the Amazons, even when it has not been explicitly framed as one. Apollo, god of the sun of prophecy of truth, has a more ambiguous relationship with Diana across the years. In certain modern storylines, he becomes a direct antagonist, a god who overreaches into the throne of Olympus and creates a crisis that requires Diana to act in ways that push her beyond what she had previously understood herself capable of. His story is important not because he is a great villain, but because he demonstrates something essential, that the corruption of a genuinely powerful thing is more dangerous than the straightforward malice of an obviously wicked one. These encounters, with Hera's wounded majesty, Athena's considered regard, Hermes' quicksilver sidelong affection, Apollo's beautiful arrogance, shaped Diana in ways that combat and diplomacy alone could not. She was learning, through direct relationship, what godhood actually was, not the clean concept of it, not the ideal that Themyscira's myths had transmitted to her, the lived reality, with all its complications and failures and unexpected tenderness. What she was discovering was that the gods were not better than humans. They were not what you would become if you removed the human limitations of mortality and weakness. They were human qualities, all of them, the magnificent and the terrible, scaled up to cosmic dimensions. Zeus's love was real, and it was also careless. Hera's grief was real, and it was also vast enough to cause earthquakes. Ares's rage was real, and it nourished itself on the most human of all human capacities, the capacity for violence in the name of something that feels like principle. Diana occupied a space between the gods and the humans that no one else in the story occupied. She had the capacity of a god, and the perspective of a person who had lived in a community of people for whom history was not abstract. She had been raised by women who could tell her in specific terms what a particular war had felt like from inside the experiencing of it. She carried that knowledge into every interaction with the Olympians, and it was for them genuinely disorienting. Let that settle now. The story's moving towards something larger, and there is no need to race toward it. Let the images arrive and dissolve, the gods at their complicated business. Diana between them and the world they press upon. The slow accumulation of understanding that comes not from being taught, but from living long enough in proximity to difficult truths. The Olympians existed in the DC mythology, in a state of perpetual domestic drama that would have been comic if the scale of its consequences had not been so large. Their relationships with each other were ancient enough that every interaction carried layers of prior meaning. Every conversation between Zeus and Hera, for example, occurred in the context of a marriage that had existed longer than most of the civilizations that had worshipped them. A marriage built on genuine connection and genuine betrayal in equal measure, sustained by a combination of love and mutual dependency, and the specific kind of determination that long relationships develop when neither party can imagine a life that does not include the other. Diana moved through these dynamics with a combination of respect and refusal that the Olympians had rarely encountered. She respected their power, their age, their knowledge of things that even the Amazons' complete libraries did not contain. She refused, quietly, consistently, without drama, to be diminished by them, to accept their categories, to perform the kind of deference that would have made her manageable. She addressed them as what they were, extraordinarily powerful and ancient beings who were also, in certain fundamental respects, not as developed as they might have been. This refusal was not disrespect. It was paradoxically a deeper form of respect than they usually received. Most beings who encountered the Olympians were either worshipful or terrified, or both, and the Olympians had adapted to this response over the millennia in ways that had not always been good for them. When Diana looked at a god and engaged with that god as someone genuinely worth arguing with, not as a superior to be placated or an obstacle to be appeased, but as a being whose nature and choices had the implications that deserved serious engagement, the experience was unfamiliar enough to be, in several documented cases, genuinely unsettling. Ares himself, in the encounters Diana had with him before their final confrontation, displayed this unsettlement. He expected her to be afraid of him. Gods of war generally are feared, and fear generates a particular kind of deference that Ares had grown accustomed to over millennia. When Diana engaged with him instead as an intellectual adversary, whose argument she intended to refute through the evidence of her own existence, he did not know at first how to respond. He adapted eventually. The story would not have the confrontation it ultimately has if he had not. But the initial displacement, the moment in which he encountered a being who looked at what he was and found it worth engaging rather than simply worth fleeing, was real, and the story knows it. The question of what the gods owed the beings who worshipped them was one that the Olympians had never fully resolved among themselves. In the earliest eras of their relationship with humanity, the transaction had seemed clear: worship and sacrifice in exchange for divine favour, and occasionally divine protection. The Olympians had found this arrangement comfortable, because it required very little of them that they were not already inclined to provide. The occasional intervention, the granted prayer, the lifted hand that turned the tide of a battle or a storm, while providing them with the sustaining energy of human devotion. The arrangement became less comfortable as human civilization developed its own resources and found itself less in need of divine assistance for the practical management of its world. The prayers became less frequent. The temples fell into disrepair and were eventually repurposed. The Olympians, who had calibrated their sense of their own importance around the intensity of human worship, found themselves facing a question that made no historical sense to them. If they were no longer needed in the way they once had been, what were they for? Diana's presence in their divine order introduced a different frame for this question. She had not come to Olympus because she needed its resources, or because she sought its validation. She'd come because her capabilities and her responsibilities had brought her there, because the role she was being asked to steward existed in the divine order and required her to be in it. She was not there to worship or to seek favour. She was there to work. And the work ethic she brought, the complete orientation toward the purpose of a role rather than its prestige, was, for beings who had spent millennia being the objects of other people's purposes, genuinely instructive. The night is quiet, the breath is slow. You're already somewhere between the story and sleep, and either place is exactly right. You're somewhere between waking and not. This is a good place to be. The mind is still present enough to follow a thread of thought, but the body has already begun the longer work of the night. Let it do that work, You're not required to supervise it. There is a moment in every great mythological story where the thing the story has been building toward finally arrives. The moment is usually not what the characters expected. It is not the resolution of the central conflict, but the transformation of it. The point at which the question the story was asking reveals itself to be different from the question everyone thought they were answering. For Diana, that moment is the death of Ares. In different tellings of the story, it arrives differently. In the 2017 film, it comes in a ruined village, in the rain, against a sky lit by something more than ordinary fire. In the comics, it has happened across multiple storylines, each time in circumstances that reshape its meaning. But the structure of the moment is always the same. Diana faces Ares directly, and she wins. The winning is not the point, or rather, the winning is not where the meaning of the moment lives. The meaning lives in what she discovers in the process of winning, about Ares, about herself, and about the nature of what she has been carrying since she left Themyscira. Ares, in his final confrontation with Diana, does not simply fight her. He makes an argument. He does this in different ways in different versions of the story, but the core of the argument is always the same. Look at them. Look at the humans you are trying to save. Look at what they are doing to each other and to this world. They have not needed me for this. They are capable of all of this without any encouragement from me at all. I am not the cause of what is wrong with them. I am simply the witness. And in some versions of the argument, I am the honest one. I see them clearly. You are the one still pretending that they are worth saving. This is not a stupid argument. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Ares as an antagonist in Diana's story. He is not making a stupid argument. He is making an intelligent argument, grounded in observable evidence, delivered with the conviction of a being who has watched humanity for thousands of years and genuinely believes he understands it. Breathe in slowly. The breath is your anchor. Let it arrive. Let it leave. Let everything else be slightly further away than the breath. Sit with this. The argument Ares makes is the argument that cynicism has always made, in every era, about every attempt to improve the conditions of human life. It is the argument that says the evidence of what people do at their worst is a more accurate picture of what people are than the evidence of what people do at their best. It is the argument that hope is a delusion, that compassion is naivete dressed up as virtue, that the person who still believes in the capacity of human beings to change has simply not been watching carefully enough or long enough. Diana's answer to this argument is not a philosophical counter-argument. She does not debunk his evidence or contest his logic. She does something more difficult and more definitive. She demonstrates that the argument is wrong by being the living proof that it is wrong. She's a being who has watched humanity as long as Ares has, who has, if anything, been closer to it, more intimately acquainted with its specific and detailed capacity for suffering and for love, and she has not arrived where he has arrived. Not because she's blind to what he sees. She sees it. She has seen it up close, personally, in people she loved and lost and mourned and continued past. She does not win the argument by denying the evidence. She wins it by existing as evidence that the evidence can be read differently. The killing of Ares, in the versions where she kills him, is not a triumphant moment in the way that the climactic defeats of villains in lesser stories are triumphant. It is a mournful one. Ares is not simply a monster. He is her oldest enemy, and he is also, in the deepest mythological sense, a member of her own family. He is the darkness to her light, the destruction to her creation, the ancient opposition that her existence was specifically designed to counter, and there is something in confronting that directly that is not cleanly satisfying. In some versions, she does not kill him. In some versions, she defeats him, and then extends to him the same thing she extends to every defeated opponent. Not triumphalism, but the offer of something else. In these versions, the defeat of Ares is not the elimination of war, but the demonstration that war's loudest advocate is not as inevitable as he believed himself to be. He can be stopped. He has been stopped. The thing he called human nature has produced in Diana the proof that it is something more complicated than he could account for. What happens to Ares after his defeat varies, but what happens to Diana does not vary. She is changed by it. The encounter has forced her to hold, in close proximity, the most coherent possible version of the argument against everything she believes, and to feel the full weight of that argument, and to choose, clearly and consciously, to remain who she is. This is different from never having been tested. This is the kind of conviction that only arrives after the test. The modern echo of this, the thing that connects this ancient divine confrontation to the people who watch Diana's story across theatres and comic panels and streaming screens, is this. Most people, at some point in their lives, encounter a version of Ares' argument. It might not come from a god. It might come from grief, or exhaustion, or the accumulated evidence of too many years in proximity to the things that do not improve. The internal voice that says, the optimism was naive, the kindness was not rewarded, the effort was not worth what it cost. Diana's answer to that voice is the same answer she gives Ares. She does not deny the evidence. She simply continues to be a counterexample to the conclusion it is being used to support. The response to the argument against hope is not another argument. It is the continued practice of the thing the argument claims is impossible. Let that thought settle now as the breath settles. The body is growing quieter. The thoughts are becoming less distinct, more like impressions, more like the memory of a thing rather than the thing itself. The story is still here. It will be here. You are allowed to drift. The landscape of the final confrontation between Diana and Ares, wherever it takes place, in whatever version of the story, always carries a quality of aftermath, as if the fight has already happened and what is occurring is not the fight itself but the working out of its consequences. This quality is not accidental. The writers who have done this scene most effectively have understood that the real confrontation between Diana and Ares has been happening for the entire story. In every choice she made that contradicted his worldview, in every life she protected that his logic would have dismissed as acceptable loss, in every moment she chose honesty when strategic deception was available. The physical fight, when it comes, is the form that the argument takes when language has been exhausted, and Ares is never more dangerous than in this moment, not because his power is at its peak, though it is, but because his argument is never more coherent than when he is making it with his full divine strength, when the evidence of his power is undeniable and the question of whether Diana can withstand it is genuinely open. He is not simply trying to destroy her. He is trying to prove something. He has always been trying to prove something. The tragedy of Ares, in the versions of the story that treat him with full seriousness, is that his need to prove himself right is inseparable from his power, and this need makes him ultimately unable to adapt to evidence that contradicts him. Diana's winning is not inevitable in the way that certain stories make their climaxes inevitable. There is genuine peril in the confrontation, genuine uncertainty about whether what she carries, which is not simply power, but a particular configuration of conviction and experience and love, is sufficient against what he brings, which is ancient and enormous, and has been growing for as long as war has existed. The peril is part of the meaning. A victory that was never in doubt would prove nothing. What needs to be demonstrated, what the whole long project of Diana's story has been building toward demonstrating, is that her way of being in the world is not simply preferable to Ares's on moral grounds. It is more powerful. The position that includes compassion, that integrates honesty, that maintains genuine relationship with the people it is trying to protect, is, in the actual event of conflict, stronger than the position that reduces everything to force. After Ares falls, or is defeated, or is transformed depending on the specific telling, the landscape does not celebrate. The sky does not clear. The world does not immediately reorganize itself into something better. This is the realistic note that the best tellings of this story strike, and it is important. Defeating the god of war does not end war. Disabling the divine amplifier of human conflict does not eliminate the human capacity for conflict. Diana has always known this, and the story knows it too. What the defeat of Ares achieves is not the elimination of violence, but the removal of its most committed divine advocate. The being who has been, for thousands of years, actively cultivating the conditions for conflict's spread. The work that remains after his defeat is not less than the work that preceded it. It is simply different work. The aftermath of Ares' defeat created a silence in the DC Universe's divine architecture that was immediately felt even by those who had no direct awareness of its cause. War did not end. Diana had always known it would not. human beings did not suddenly find themselves without the impulse toward conflict. The conditions that had generated the wars Ares had been feeding on were not conditions that existed only because of Ares. They were conditions generated by human history, human inequality, human fear, human competition for resources and status and safety. What changed in the aftermath was subtler than the absence of war. It was the absence of the divine amplification, the ancient, patient pressure that had been applied to human tendencies toward conflict for as long as those tendencies had existed, nudging them toward expression rather than resolution, toward escalation rather than de-escalation. Without that pressure, human beings were still capable of war. They were also, somewhat more frequently, capable of choosing otherwise. The margin was not large. The difference it made across decades of human history was real. Diana understood this and did not find it sufficient. The gap between the world as it was and the world as it could be remained enormous, and the removal of one divine amplifier of human conflict was not an answer to the structural conditions that generated that conflict in the first place. She knew this. She had always known it. The knowledge that the work was far from finished was not discouraging to her, because she had never expected otherwise. She had left Themyscira with the understanding that she was not going to fix the world in a season. She was going to work on it for as long as she existed, and she existed for a very long time. The conversation Diana had with Ares in the moments before or after their final confrontation, the version of it that the story returns to again and again in various forms, is always a conversation about loneliness. Not explicitly, neither of them uses the word. But underneath the ideological argument, underneath the demonstration of divine power, underneath everything that the confrontation is officially about, there is a recognition between them of something they share that neither of them has shared with anyone else, the experience of being the designated opposition to something. Ares has spent his existence as the god of what humanity destroys itself with. Diana has spent hers as the champion of what humanity could be instead. Neither of these roles is comfortable. Neither of them allows for the ordinary rest of a being who simply exists in the world without being responsible for a concept. The death of Ares was not an ending. It was a threshold. What Diana stepped through on the other side of it was something the story had been building towards since the first moment she left Themyscira. Something that would take years more to fully understand, and that she would not be the only one who needed to understand it. The quiet has deepened now. The breath moves at its own pace, slow and easy, and the sounds of wherever you are have receded to the edge of things, present but not demanding. This is the hour when the mind loosens its grip on the day. Let it. The day is finished. There is only this. In the New 52 era of DC Comics, the continuity that restructured the DC Universe beginning in 2011, Brian Azzarello and Cliff Chiang told a version of Wonder Woman's story that took what the character had always implied and made it explicit. The arc, which ran for 3 years and is considered among the finest sustained Wonder Woman narratives ever published, culminated in something that changed the terms of Diana's existence in a permanent and meaningful way. She became the god of war. Let that arrive slowly, not as a fact to be catalogued, but as a weight to be felt. After the events of that arc, in which the Olympian pantheon was devastated by a series of crises, in which gods died and were reborn and were destroyed again, in which the very structure of divine inheritance was shown to be far more unstable than any of its inhabitants had been comfortable acknowledging, a vacancy existed. Ares was gone. The role he had occupied in the architecture of reality was not simply a title, it was a function. The universe, as DC's mythology understands it, requires that certain forces be embodied and sustained by beings capable of containing them. War had always been one of those forces. The gods who remained looked at Diana. The universe, in its own way, looked at Diana. And the story made its argument that the most appropriate steward of the concept of war, the being best suited to hold the mantle of the god of war, was not someone who loved war, not someone who was nourished by it, not someone whose power grew with every conflict and shrank with every peace. It was someone who understood war completely, who had walked through its fullest expression without being transformed into it, who could hold the mantle of war with full knowledge of what it was and remain, through the holding of it, oriented toward its ending. Breathe in, The breath is even now, slow. The body is carrying you somewhere quieter than this, and you are welcome to follow it. This is a genuinely radical idea in the structure of superhero mythology. Most superhero narratives are built around the separation of the hero and the thing they fight. The hero is the opposite of the villain, the light to the darkness, the order to the chaos. Diana as god of war collapses that structure. She's not simply the opponent of war, she is its steward. She holds the concept of war within herself, fully aware of what it contains, and directs that awareness toward a purpose that war, left to its own logic, could never arrive at on its own. What this means in practical terms, in the terms of the story and the terms of what changes for Diana after this elevation, is that her understanding of conflict shifts, not her opposition to it. She does not become an advocate for war because she is now its divine representative, but she comes to understand war not as an aberration, not as a failure of human nature that exists outside the proper order of things, but as a force that is genuinely present in the world, and that requires someone wise enough and strong enough to manage it, to direct its inevitable expression away from destruction and toward the particular kind of clarity that sometimes only arrives through the pressure of conflict. This is not a comfortable idea. The story does not present it as comfortable. Diana herself is not comfortable with it, and that discomfort is precisely what makes her the right person to hold the mantle. A god of war who was comfortable with war would be Ares again, an entirely different shape wearing the same crown. What the universe needed, what the story was arguing, was a god of war who would spend every moment of divine tenure trying to make the role unnecessary. The connection to Diana as she has always been is important to trace here. From her very first days on Themyscira, she was asking why war existed. As a champion, she walked into wars to end them rather than to win them. As an ambassador, she carried the message that the world did not have to be as it was. The elevation to god of war did not change what she cared about. It gave her a different position from which to pursue the same end. There is also something in this elevation that concerns truth, her oldest and deepest commitment. Ares, as god of war, had always worked through deception. He whispered false premises into the ears of leaders, that the other side was more threatening than it was, that the resources being sought were more essential than they were, that there was no alternative to violence when alternatives existed. The lies of war are often more destructive than the war itself, because the lies outlast the conflict. Diana, as god of war, could not lie. The lasso of truth, the instrument she had carried since leaving Themyscira, was not simply a weapon, it was an expression of her fundamental nature. She is constitutionally oriented toward honesty in a way that goes deeper than moral commitment. It is what she is. And this constitutional honesty, brought to the mantle of the god of war, meant that war itself, the concept, the force, the divine function, was now being stewarded by a being who could not use deception as its primary instrument. This is what the story means by her becoming a god among gods. Not that she became more powerful than the others, though in this form her power was extraordinary. Not that she became more important in the divine hierarchy, though the role of god of war has always been among the most consequential in the pantheon. It means that she brought something into the divine order that the divine order had not previously contained, godhood with a genuinely ethical orientation. The other Olympians are not evil. This is a nuance worth holding. They are not malicious in the way that purely fictional villains are malicious. They are beings of immense power who have had very little reason, across their long existence, to develop the kind of moral reasoning that only comes from genuine constraint. Diana, raised among humans, living among humans, loving specific humans and losing them to time, had developed that reasoning in a way the other gods simply had not. She arrived among them as one of them finally, and she was still herself. That was the miracle of it, the thing that made it matter. The transition from champion to deity, from the woman who fights for the world to the god who is responsible for one of its fundamental forces, required Diana to expand her understanding of what responsibility meant. As a champion, responsibility was personal and immediate. It concerned the specific situation she was present for, the specific people whose lives intersected with her capacity to help. She was accountable for her choices, for the uses of her strength, for the accuracy of her judgment in conditions of urgency. These were significant responsibilities, and she had taken them seriously. As the god of war, responsibility was categorical. She was not simply accountable for her individual choices. She was accountable for the concept of war itself, for the way it existed as a force in the world, for the conditions in which it manifested, for the relationship between its inevitability and its manageability. This was a different scale of responsibility, and it required a different kind of consciousness. She had to hold, simultaneously, the specific and the general, the individual battlefield and the divine concept, the particular soldier and the eternal force, the immediate cost and the long consequence. She found, in taking on this responsibility, that it clarified something she'd been attempting to articulate for a long time. The question she'd been asking since childhood, why does war exist when peace is preferable, was not, she now understood, fully answerable in the terms it had been asked. War existed not because humans were deficient or because Ares was malicious, but because the capacity for conflict is inseparable from the capacity for conviction. A being that cannot be moved to fight for something it values, cannot be roused from neutrality by genuine injustice, is also a being that cannot genuinely value anything. The capacity for war and the capacity for love are the same capacity oriented differently. Managing one is managing both. This understanding did not make her comfortable with war, it made her more precise about it. The question shifted from why does war exist to when is the use of force a genuine expression of values rather than their betrayal, and this question, which is the genuine ethical question at the heart of every conflict, the one that people and nations and civilizations have struggled with across history, was now her divine responsibility to hold clearly, to think about carefully and to answer in specific situations with the full weight of everything she knew. The other Olympians adjusted to her elevation with varying degrees of ease. Some were genuinely relieved. The role of god of war had always been a destabilizing presence in the divine order, and a god of war who was oriented toward peace's preservation rather than war's propagation was, from the perspective of divine stability, an improvement on the previous arrangement. Some were less certain. The discomfort in those cases was not malicious but structural. She represented something the existing categories could not neatly contain, and systems built on categories always find the uncategorizable unsettling. The practical reality of being the god of war was considerably more complex than the conceptual reality. In the conceptual version, Diana holds the divine portfolio of war and stewards it wisely, directing its energies toward constructive ends and ensuring that the force of conflict is channeled toward resolution rather than destruction. In the practical version, the divine portfolio of war is a vast and ungovernable thing that includes every conflict being fought anywhere in the world at any given moment, every border dispute, every domestic violence situation, every civil war, every geopolitical tension being managed by people with incomplete information and high stakes. She could not intervene in all of it. She had never been able to intervene in all of it, even as a champion. As a god, the awareness of all of it was more acute, but the practical capacity to address all of it remained finite. She had to develop, and this was perhaps the most painful part of the elevation, a wisdom about prioritization that accepted, as a permanent condition, that something she was aware of and could not address would unfold in ways that she would have prevented if she'd been able to. This is not a wisdom that comes easily. It is the wisdom that anyone who works in any form of care or service eventually arrives at, and it always costs something to learn it. The cost she paid for this wisdom was real, and the story does not conceal it. She made choices. She prioritized some situations over others, using criteria that she examined constantly and revised when they proved insufficient. She got it wrong sometimes, chose to be somewhere that turned out not to need her, while something elsewhere that did need her unfolded without her presence. She held these failures not as occasions for self-punishment, but as information, data points in the ongoing effort to make the prioritization decisions better next time. This is, it turns out, also a very human way to inhabit responsibility. The gods of Olympus had not been doing it this way. She brought it with her. Let the thought go now. Let the words dissolve the way a stone dissolves in water, slowly, without sharp edges, becoming part of something larger and quieter. The story is moving toward its rest, and you are moving with it. The breath is very slow now. The body is far away, somewhere quiet and warm, and the mind is following it at a gentle distance. There is no effort required for any of this. Letting go is not an action. It is the stopping of an action. And you are very good at it, even if you do not always believe that you are. Among the gods of the DC universe, power takes many forms. Poseidon commands the sea, the weight of all the world's water, the pressure of the deep places, the restlessness of a surface that is never entirely still. Hephaestus commands fire and craft, the transformation of raw material into something shaped by intention. Zeus commands lightning and authority, the specific power of the being who stands at the top of a hierarchy and whose word carries the weight of consequence. Diana commands truth. This is her divine power in its purest form, and it is worth taking seriously as a form of power, because the story has always taken it seriously even when certain tellings have not. The lasso of truth is not simply a weapon that happens to compel honesty. It is a material expression of something that lives in Diana at a level deeper than choice. Truth, as a divine power, is more dangerous than most of what the other gods can produce. Lightning can destroy a building. The sea can swallow a city. Fire can reduce almost anything to ash. But deception, sustained and organized, can reduce an entire civilization's sense of reality to something that no longer corresponds to the world as it actually is. And it can do this without anyone pointing a weapon, without any single dramatic act of destruction, simply through the accumulated pressure of untrue things repeated often enough to become familiar. Sit with this for a moment. The thought is not urgent. Let it settle at its own pace. Diana's orientation toward truth is not a moral stance that she has chosen the way a person chooses a political position. It is her nature. This distinction matters because it means that her commitment to truth does not waver under pressure in the way that chosen commitments sometimes do. You cannot tire her out of honesty. You cannot gradually shift the context of her existence until she finds deception more convenient than truth. She does not experience the calculation that precedes the decision to deceive, because the calculation does not occur. What makes this divine rather than simply admirable is its scope. Human honesty is local. It pertains to the specific exchanges a person has with the specific people in their life. Divine honesty, as Diana embodies it, is cosmological. It is an orientation toward reality as a whole. When she holds the lasso and it responds to a person's true feelings, it is not performing a parlor trick. It is allowing reality to be visible in the place where reality is most often hidden. In the self-representation of a conscious being who has decided, for whatever reasons, to present a version of themselves that is something other than true. This power has interesting implications for her role as god of war. War, historically in both the world of the story and in the world outside it, is almost always accompanied by a narrative, a story about why this war is necessary, why the people on the other side of it deserve what is being done to them, why the violence being enacted is somehow different from the violence that has been enacted before. These narratives are rarely entirely true. They simplify, they omit, they frame in ways that make the violence more palatable than it would be if presented without editorial softening. A god of war who commands truth is a god of war who strips those narratives down to their actual content, who makes it impossible for war to sustain the deceptions that allow it to present itself as noble. This does not stop war. Diana has never been under the illusion that simply revealing truth is sufficient to prevent violence, but it changes the conditions under which war is waged. It makes honesty about cost and cause and consequence a permanent presence in the space where those decisions are made. The lasso itself has a quality in the story that is easy to overlook in adaptations that focus on its restraining function. It does not simply prevent lying, it creates the conditions for genuine communication, the kind of exchange between two people or two groups that cannot happen when either party is operating on a false picture of reality. In this sense, it is less a weapon than a prerequisite, a precondition for the kind of understanding that makes resolution possible. Diana's godhood in all its forms is about this, not the accumulation of power for its own sake, not the demonstration of superiority over other beings. It is about the creation and maintenance of conditions in which genuine human and divine flourishing becomes possible. She is a god who is interested in what godhood is for, in a company of beings who have largely stopped asking that question. This is the modern echo worth pausing on, very gently, before the story closes towards sleep. The people who love Wonder Woman, who have loved her since William Moulton Marston created her in 1941, through every iteration and reimagining that has followed in the decades since, love her for reasons that are not always easy to articulate but that feel, when you encounter the best versions of her, like something true. She represents a particular kind of strength that is not aggressive, a particular kind of power that is not interested in demonstrating itself, a particular quality of attention, the willingness to look at the world as it actually is, with all of its wreckage and beauty, and to remain genuinely interested in its improvement. These are not simply superhero qualities. They are qualities that the people watching her story are working on in their own lives, in the specific and unglamorous circumstances that make up an ordinary existence. The person who is trying to remain honest when deception would be easier, the person who is trying to remain compassionate when cynicism would be more comfortable, the person who is watching the evidence for Ares's argument accumulate and choosing, daily, not to arrive at Ares's conclusion. Diana as a god is not above any of this. She is the divine expression of it. She is what those choices look like when they are made consistently, across a very long time, by someone who has every reason to know how difficult they are. The gods of Olympus, by the time Diana takes her full place among them, are changed by her presence. Not reformed, the story is never that tidy, but changed. The divine order, which had been a closed system for a very long time, has admitted something that did not fit its previous categories, and the admission has had effects that are still reverberating in the story, still being worked out in the lives of the characters, still producing unexpected moments of honesty in places where there used to be only the comfortable performance of power. Let your breathing slow now, as slow as it wants to go. The thoughts are becoming thinner, less distinct, more like the memory of thoughts than thoughts themselves. This is the right direction. This is the body knowing what it needs and moving toward it without being told. Truth is a form of rest. When the performance stops, when the story we tell about ourselves settles back into what we actually are, there is a particular quiet that arrives. Diana has always known this quiet. She has been moving toward it, in one form or another, since the first breath she took on the island at the edge of the world. The philosophers who built the traditions that eventually produced the concept of truth as something worth pursuing for its own sake, the Greek thinkers who wrote on papyrus in rooms not entirely unlike the rooms of Themyscira's library, understood something that the simpler advocacy for honesty often misses, that truth is not simply the opposite of lying, it is a relationship with reality. The liar knows what is true and departs from it deliberately, but there are many other ways to be estranged from reality, through wishful thinking, through the comfort of familiar narratives, through the specific form of self-deception that occurs when a person has believed something useful for so long that they have forgotten how to distinguish between its usefulness and its accuracy. Diana's divine power addresses all of these forms of estrangement, not only the deliberate one. The lasso in her hands is not simply a lie detector, it is a reality anchor, a device that connects a person's self-presentation to the actual texture of their experience that makes it impossible to maintain, in the presence of this particular truth force, the distance between what is felt and what is said. This is uncomfortable for almost everyone, because almost everyone maintains some version of that distance. It is not necessarily dishonest, it is protective. The full truth of what a person feels in every moment, presented without editorial management to everyone they encounter, would be exhausting for all parties. Social life requires a certain amount of selective presentation. The lasso does not judge this. What it does is cut through it when the full truth is what the situation requires, when a crisis is unfolding that cannot be navigated on the basis of partial information, when a decision needs to be made that depends on knowing not the diplomatic version of a person's position but the actual version. In these moments, the truth that the lasso makes available is not a punishment. It is a service. It is the thing that allows the situation to be resolved on the basis of what is actually real, rather than what everyone involved is pretending is real. In her divine capacity, Diana extended this principle beyond individual interactions. The god of war with a commitment to truth was, in practice, a god who insisted that every conflict she was involved in, whether as participant, arbiter, or witness, be conducted on an honest accounting of what was at stake and why. Not the official accounting, not the version that the parties involved found most advantageous to present. The actual accounting, with all its complexities and ambiguities and moral difficulties intact. This is more demanding than it sounds. People at war, groups of people in conflict, individuals in dispute, have very strong reasons to prefer the version of events that supports their position. The honest version is almost always more complicated. It almost always contains elements that each side would prefer to not acknowledge. It almost always reveals that the situation arrived where it arrived through a series of choices made by multiple parties, none of which is entirely innocent and none of which is entirely culpable. This kind of moral complexity is not comfortable. It does not produce satisfying narratives of heroism and villainy. But it is what truth looks like in practice, and Diana, as its divine representative, was committed to it. The relationship between truth and power has been one of the central questions of political philosophy for as long as political philosophy has existed. The people who accumulate power generally prefer a world in which truth is flexible, in which the narrative can be adjusted to serve the needs of the moment, in which facts are not fixed but negotiable, in which the person who controls the story controls the reality. This preference is not always cynical. Sometimes it is genuinely motivated by the belief that the full truth, unmanaged, will produce worse outcomes than a carefully curated version of it. Sometimes the person managing the truth has convinced themselves that their management is in service of a greater good. Diana's divine commitment to truth cuts through all of this without negotiation. Not because she is naive about the complexity of political reality. She has been living inside complex political reality for a very long time. But because she has seen, repeatedly, what happens when the management of truth is permitted to run its natural course. The comfortable lie extends. The comfortable lie requires companion lies to support it. The companion lies require a structure to maintain them. The structure becomes an institution. The institution develops its own interests in the perpetuation of the lies that sustain it. And at the end of this process, the people living inside the structure of maintained lies no longer have access to the information they would need to make genuine choices about their own lives. Truth, in Diana's understanding, is not simply a moral value. It is a prerequisite for agency. A person who does not have access to an accurate picture of their situation cannot genuinely choose their response to it. They can only respond to the picture they have been given, which is someone else's construction. The lasso, in this sense, is not a tool for winning arguments. It is a tool for restoring the conditions under which genuine argument, genuine encounter between beings with actual positions rather than managed presentations, can occur. The Amazons of Themyscira understood long before Diana was born that the most effective form of power is not the power that announces itself. The most effective form of power is the power that changes the conditions in which choices are made, that makes certain choices easier and others harder, that alters the landscape of possibility without ever declaring itself to be doing so. This is what truth does, at scale, when it is genuinely available. It does not force any particular outcome, it changes the conditions under which outcomes are chosen. Diana, as the divine representative of truth, was not in the business of making decisions for the beings whose conflicts she entered. She was in the business of ensuring that when those beings made their decisions, they made them with access to what was actually real. The last segment is not far now. Let yourself drift toward it, or past it. Either way is right. You are very close to sleep now. The body knows this. The mind is somewhere between story and the deeper quiet that the story has been leading you toward. There is nothing you need to do with this moment except allow it. The night is long. There is no hurry. In the long tradition of mythologies that have imagined what gods are and what they want and what distinguishes them from the beings they preside over, there is an assumption so old it has become almost invisible, that a god who chooses humanity is making a sacrifice, that divinity and human connection are in tension with each other, and that the god who moves toward the human is moving away from something greater. Diana's story makes a different argument. It has been making it quietly across every segment of this telling, in the way she was raised, in the way she left Themyscira, in the way she fought and loved and grieved and continued, in the way she stood in the space between gods and humans and refused to pretend that the distance between those two things was fixed. The argument is this: divinity and full humanity are not opposites. The god who chooses to remain in genuine relationship with human beings, not as a patron, not as a protector standing at a safe distance, but as a being who is genuinely moved by what moves them, genuinely diminished by what diminishes them, genuinely changed by the encounter, is not giving up something. They are completing something. Diana returned to the world after her elevation. She returned, and she continued to do what she had always done. Not because godhood had not changed her, but because what she had become was a fuller version of what she had always been. The god of war who wanted to make war unnecessary. The divine steward of truth in a world full of comfortable fictions. The daughter of Zeus who loved, with unhesitating commitment, the daughters and sons of ordinary people who had never heard of Themyscira. She sat with the same grief that human beings sit with. She lost people. She watched generations live and die. She was present for the specific and irreplaceable suffering of individuals, and she was present for the collective suffering of peoples, and she did not find a way to become numb to either of these things. The numbness would have been easier. It would have been, in some sense, what godhood offers, the ability to take the long view, to see the arc rather than the specific moment, to locate comfort in the scale of things rather than the texture of them. She chose the texture. She chose to remain someone for whom a specific person's specific suffering was not merely a data point in a larger pattern, but an immediate call on her attention and her care. This is not a failure of divine perspective. It is its own kind of divine quality, the capacity to remain, across a very long life, genuinely interested in the individual. Breathe in slowly one more time, let the chest rise, let it fall, let the body go wherever it is going. The story of Wonder Woman, in all its versions, across all its decades, through every reimagining that has tried to locate what she is for, has always been, at its heart, a story about this choice, a being of divine capability who could stand above the world and does not, who could remove herself from the mess and the loss of human life and does not, who has, at every available opportunity, chosen proximity over safety. This is why she matters to the people who love her. Not because she's invincible, though she is in most circumstances very difficult to stop. Not because she is wise, though she is, after a very long time of encountering difficult truths and remaining open to them, genuinely wise. She matters because the choice she models is a choice that every person who has ever cared about something larger than themselves has had to make. The choice between the safety of distance and the cost of proximity. Between the comfort of the long view and the demand of the immediate one. She makes the choice that love requires, again and again, across decades of story and centuries of fictional time, and in every specific moment that the narrative places in front of her. The choice is never final. It is always happening. She is always, in every version of herself, in the middle of making it. If you are still following this, let the words grow quieter now. They have been carrying you, and now they are setting you down somewhere soft. The island is still there, its honey-coloured stone, its old trees, its horses with their considering eyes. The gods are still there, complicated and ancient and faintly changed by the presence of someone who refused to let them be comfortable in their distance from the world. Diana's still there, somewhere in the DC universe, in the specific version of reality that universe constructs. She's still doing what she has always done. Moving toward the thing that needs to be addressed, telling the truth when a comfortable lie would have been easier, remaining genuinely present in a world that has given her every reason to hold herself at arm's length. Let the image of her fade now, not because it is not beautiful, but because you no longer need it. The story has been delivered. It lives now in the part of you that receives stories, the deep part, below the part that follows plot and above the part that generates dreams. It will settle there, over the hours of the night, becoming something that is yours rather than something you borrowed. The breath is barely there now, rising and falling with the slow certainty of something that does not need to be thought about. The room is the right temperature. The darkness is the right quality of dark. The night is doing exactly what nights are supposed to do. You have been somewhere ancient and somewhere true tonight. You have been to an island at the edge of the world, and you have followed a god who chose to remain human in all the ways that matter, and you have arrived here, at the quiet end of a long story, at the edge of sleep, in a darkness that is not empty but full of the particular rest that comes after something has been understood. Sleep well now. The island will be there if you want to return to it. The story will wait. It has been waiting for a very long time, and it is very patient, and it is not going anywhere. There is a version of immortality that is isolating. The version in which you outlive everyone you love repeatedly until the grief of outliving them becomes a kind of armor, and the armor becomes a kind of distance, and the distance becomes, eventually, a permanent state of benign detachment in which you continue to function and to care, but from behind glass, from a position that is technically present but essentially unreachable. This is the story that many tales of immortal beings tell, because it is the intuitive story, the one that seems to follow logically from the experience of living long enough to lose everyone. Diana's story refuses this resolution. Not because she avoids loss. She does not, and the story does not protect her from it. She has lost people she loved, repeatedly, in the way that any being who remains genuinely open to other beings will inevitably lose people when those beings are mortal and she is not. She has buried friends and allies and people she loved in specific and detailed ways. She has continued past those losses not by closing the part of herself that was opened by those relationships, but by keeping it open, by remaining the kind of person to whom new relationships were possible, to whom the next person she met was genuinely worth knowing, to whom the future was not simply more of the past, but something that had not yet arrived, and therefore still contained the full range of what it could be. This is the hardest version of hope to maintain. It is easy to hope when things are going well, when the evidence supports the hope, when the people around you are alive and the causes you care about are advancing. It is much harder to hope in the specific conditions that Diana's very long life has repeatedly created, the conditions in which you have tried, carefully and with great effort, and the outcome was not what you worked toward, and the people who are trying with you are gone, and the question is whether you will try again. She always tries again. This is not presented in the best versions of her story as effortless optimism. It is presented as a choice, sometimes a difficult one, made by a being who has examined the alternative and found it to be, in the end, a worse way to live. The alternative to continued engagement with the world, the protected distance, the benign detachment, is not neutral. It is its own kind of loss. It is the loss of the capacity to be changed by what happens, which is also the loss of the capacity to genuinely participate in what happens, which is also, finally, the loss of the self that was formed in the first place by exactly that kind of genuine participation. The gods of Olympus, in their long existence, had mostly drifted toward the protected distance. They remained powerful. They remained involved, in the sense of continued influence. But they had become, across millennia, less genuinely present to the world than they had once been, less capable of being truly surprised by it, truly moved by it, truly changed by an encounter with it. Diana, arriving among them fully divine and fully herself, was a reminder of what that presence felt like, and the reminder was valuable even, especially, to beings who had long since stopped expecting to be reminded of anything. The gods who existed before Diana, the Olympians in their long, largely self-referential existence, had developed a relationship with time that was fundamentally different from the relationship mortals have with it. For mortals, time is a resource that diminishes. Every hour spent is an hour no longer available. The awareness of this scarcity shapes everything. The urgency of decisions, the weight of regret, the particular quality of attention that humans bring to things they know they will not have forever. The Olympians had lost this relationship with time. Eternity, experienced from the inside, does not feel infinite in the way that it sounds from the outside. It feels, instead, like an enormous stillness in which events occur, but in which the weight of any individual event is modulated by the certainty that there will be other events, many of them, without foreseeable end. The gods were not more wise for having more time. They were in many ways less present to the time they had, less capable of the concentrated, urgent attention that comes from knowing that this moment is one of a finite number. Diana, having been raised among women who were immortal but who carried the memory of mortality, who had been mortal once and who kept that experience alive in their culture and their practices and the stories they told, had a different relationship with time than either mortals or the Olympians. She had the duration of the immortal and the presence of the mortal. She could afford to take the long view, and she also, through sustained practice and genuine effort, maintained the ability to be fully in the short view. to be entirely present to a single conversation, a single person, a single moment, without the diffusion that immortality tends to produce. This is what it means finally to be a god who chose humanity, not to give up divine power in exchange for human limitation, not to perform humanity as a costume over divine nature, but to carry both simultaneously, to be a being of divine capability who has preserved, through conscious commitment and continuous practice, the quality of attention and the depth of connection that make existence worth having at whatever scale and duration it occurs. The story of Wonder Woman, in its longest and most complete form, the form that takes seriously everything the character has been across 8 decades of storytelling, is a story about what it looks like to persist, not to triumph, not to achieve a final resolution that makes all the difficulty worthwhile in a clean narrative sense, but to persist, to continue doing the work after the early victories have been complicated by subsequent losses, to continue loving the world after the world has demonstrated repeatedly that it is capable of being very disappointing, to continue being genuinely present to the specific and individual and irreplaceable experience of other beings when that presence is exhausting and the distance would be so much easier. This is what Diana does. This is all she does. And the story has always known that this is enough, that the persistence itself, sustained across a very long life, with full awareness of its cost, is the most heroic thing a being can do. If you enjoyed this journey through the lore of Wonder Woman's divine ascent, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always curious about that. And if there's a DC legend, a Marvel mythology, or a fictional world you want to fall asleep inside next, leave it in the comments below. Until then, rest well.